Good afternoon and good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us on this LinkedIn Live episode. My name is Gopesh Mendola, and I'm a Principal Solution Architect at Palo Alto Networks. In my current role, I help and guide customers in building solutions around Zero Trust and SASE framework. In today's conversation, we are going to talk about Zero Trust, and we will try and see the myths and the misconceptions surrounding the word Zero Trust and try to dissect it from the reality what really Zero Trust is. And in order to help me do this, I've been joined by two very super smart and dazzling guests, Ricardo Galbiati and Masayoshi Somya-san. Over to you, Ricardo.
Hey, Gopesh. Hey, Mas. Good to see you. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Welcome to our show, Ricardo.
Yeah, good to see you, Gopesh and Ricardo. It's going to be super exciting.
Okay, so to give you a quick brief, Ricardo Galbiati is our Field Chief Technology Officer at ANZ, and Mas, as we fondly call him, is our Chief Cybersecurity Strategist for Japan. And together they bring a wealth of experience of how to look, design, and implement a true Zero Trust architecture. So they have been working with customers for over, like as long as I've known Ricardo, 6+ years, and Mas for, I think, a longer period for that. Now, they will be sharing a lot of insight and expertise around it. But before we get started, I would request all our audiences and viewers to put their questions, their comments in the chat box, and we will try to answer, put our perspective around it. And even before I come back to you, gentlemen, I know you're keen to share your inputs around it. I would like to again remind our audience we have a quiz, and we would request everyone to participate in it and put your answers to the chat box, and the winner would take away a latest monitor as a winning prize. With that, let's go to our quick quiz. So there's a lot of myths and misconceptions, as I said, around it, and some of this is talking that Zero Trust is a really complex and a costly framework to implement. Let's see what the answer is. It's a myth. I don't know what people have thought about it, but this sets up a stage, and especially I want both Mas and Rick, your comments around it. Do you guys still believe that Zero Trust being here for quite some time with in the market, and people have been talking about, but still being surrounded by myths and misconceptions? Do you see the customers still struggling with it? And if they are, how can we help these customers to overcome these kind of misconceptions?
Yeah, maybe I'll go first if you don't mind, Mas. And look, Zero Trust has been around for now, what is it, 13 years? 2010, I think, was the original paper that was released around the concept of Zero Trust. It has gone through quite of a journey. And I would say that at the beginning, people were really interested in the subject because it was innovative. It was trying to change the approach to cybersecurity, especially from the networking perspective, which is where Zero Trust originally came from. But then it became a buzzword, unfortunately, and people started using it out of context. And in most cases, to try and promote maybe products or solutions and tagging them as Zero Trust compatible or delivering on Zero Trust by simply buying a particular product or solution. And that has been pretty much the get-go for the last, I'd say, 5 years, especially since the concept has been associated a lot with remote workforce. And we're going to go probably into a little bit more of the details of the specific myths and concepts about Zero Trust. But definitely the idea that Zero Trust is complex, complicated, and hard to get has discouraged a lot of organizations in the process. And I think that's probably misplaced. But Mas, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I've spoken to many organizations here in Japan, especially over the last 3 years, because when the whole pandemic kicked off about 3 years ago, everybody had to change the way they work from everybody working in the office to everybody working at home.
Yeah.
But then, all of a sudden, people started talking about zero trust within that context. And I've seen a lot of different types of myths around, like, for example, one example is like, zero trust is all about ditching VPN, for example. And, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because, zero trust is a strategy or paradigm in a nutshell. And the VPN is actually a tool or method or tactic to connect everybody to corporate resources. So, there's a bit of a gap there. But, obviously, it's understandable when customers, have a think about how to improve the security posture. At the end of the day, they have to implement something, tools and technologies. So they would like to jump on the bandwagon. But then, I find that conversation quite interesting. We've seen like, zero trust is all about ditching VPN. On top of that, I've seen things like, zero trust is all about, securing remote workforce. And also things like, zero trust is all about identity. Zero trust is all about endpoint, things like that, all these different types of story.
Yeah.
But, we have to, go back to the drawing board and, really have a think about, what zero trust is all about in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing, and I think Rick and Maz, you both brought this point up, like zero trust. I was talking to customers, they think I am implementing zero trust network access like the business, and I have zero trust, like period. Like, are you zero trust? Oh yeah, I have ZTNA. So I think, those kind of things still exist, and I think customers are still yet to, again, as I said, dissect what really zero trust is and what all these buzzwords and all of these things, myths that's surrounding around it. So now I do see, and I do feel, and I'm the opinion, it's a very important that every company, every organization should look as a zero trust. It's a very effective cybersecurity strategy, a framework which will help them, get their organizational objective there. But I still, at the time, like the way we are discussing, there is a lot of confusion. But at the same time, do you believe there is an information fatigue that customers are experiencing today? What's your thought around it?
Yeah, sure. Do you want me to talk first? Certainly, I think there is a bit of an element of fatigue here in Japan. Obviously, because we've seen different versions of zero trust coming from different vendors and different media outlets. So, obviously, that was one of the key reasons why we've seen all these misconceptions we've just talked about. And I think, a lot of focus being more around tools and technologies, not necessarily the strategy itself and its guiding principles. And, for many organizations, zero trust is, all about remote workforce for the last 3 years. But then, there's a bit of a fatigue. I've spoken to a few, cybersecurity practitioners who came to me and said, I'm a little bit fed up with zero trust now because, different vendors pitching their own stories. But now, if we look at all these, IT professionals, security practitioners, now businesses are shifting from a pure remote workforce environment to a hybrid environment, where some people may be back in the office, some people are still working at home, some people may be going on a business trip abroad. So now there is a genuine business case to really think about the whole IT infrastructure, not the subset for the long term. So I think people started realizing that they really need to implement zero trust to their entire organization or the IT infrastructure, and it needs to be applied to different use cases. So I think there's a bit of a fatigue for sure, but I think we are kind of heading in the right direction, hopefully.
I agree with you. I have to say, we are moving in the right direction. 3 years ago, if I was to ask anyone what zero trust was, and that's actually how I normally start any conversation about it, because I need to know if we are on the same page, I would have got probably a different answer from anyone in the room. It's like someone would think it's a problem in the network, someone would think it's a problem with identity, someone would think it's a problem with perimeters, and and so on, or remote workforce. I think things are slightly improving. What doesn't help, unfortunately, is the branding, right? If you go to, I wasn't there this year at RSA, but I know for a fact that any vendor conference where we have been participating, pretty much the word zero trust is printed on everyone's brochure. And unfortunately, that dilutes the message, because then people think, oh, here's another zero trust conversation, What are they going to tell us this time about it? And it becomes fatiguing and boring from a certain perspective. While I think that if done properly, zero trust is crucial. As we said, it's a crucial part of the journey towards a more secure organization. And so that's where we should start. A bit of education, but done at a thought leadership level, let's say, at a strategic perspective, and then eventually getting from there to the principles, and from the principles to the technology. So that's the approach that I've seen resonates the most with organizations I talk to.
And this whole thing where we see this information fatigue coming in, one part of it's people like us, vendors, like who would come and they would put a zero trust in a different spin. Everybody has it, and I'm not saying they're doing it incorrect way, but they have a kind of definition in their own way. And then we also have organizations like NIST, DoD, everybody coming up with their own white papers, how to achieve zero trust, how to define. Do you think are those kind of efforts which are coming from these kind of organizations is helping customers to have more clarity around zero trust?
Good question. Yeah, I'd say yes and no. Because
I was about to say exactly the same thing. Yes and no was my answer.
Right.
That's
because
the reason I think we had
yeah, I think they.
in the room.
Yeah, so NIST put together SB 800 207, I think, for zero trust architecture, and CISA also published a zero trust maturity level, as well as Forrester's got the zero trust exchange, and yeah, definitely they help. They put a structure around what are the key elements of zero trust, what are the guiding principles, what kind of methods would be applied or useful in different scenarios. But then at the end of the day, maybe you might have talked about it, Ricardo, but at the end of the day, it's all about people's interpretation of how they read it. So, maybe if you are really into identity, then, if you see identity element in the document, you probably think that that's going to be probably the key element, not necessarily network or devices or things like that. So, they definitely help, but then at the end of the day, people make different interpretations, and I've seen that here in Japan, even out of the NIST publications. So it's a bit of a challenge here.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And look, at the end of the day, I think it's important to try and find one single statement, or at least a high-level definition of what zero trust is that kind of transcends all the technology behind it. And one that I really like is the idea that zero trust is trying to secure organization by removing the concept of implicit trust. If you think about it, that's broad enough as an element to be applicable to all use cases. We're talking about what is implicit trust in the context of networking. Well, if you are within a perimeter, you're more trusted than the outside of the perimeter. That's implicit trust. You want to get rid of that. By consequence, you want to try and minimize the use of perimeter security, because that's kind of creating that situation. But implicit trust exists even on the endpoint. Like when we assign or we give an endpoint device, or let's say a laptop to a user, we implicitly trust that the applications that are running on it are all legitimate, that nothing can execute maliciously on it, or even the applications that are installed by the desktop team effectively can be compromised. We trust those applications. So we need to get rid of that implicit trust there, observing all the behavior that happens while these applications execute and so on. And finally, even in cloud, if we think about how we develop applications nowadays, open source, recycling code, being very fast, but reutilizing packages that might become vulnerable in the future because we trust them. So you see that everywhere we kind of trust technology that could be used against us. And that's at a high level what we're trying to get rid of. And we should talk about how to get rid of implicit trust. And that's a whole conversation on its own.
Yeah. So I think I want to move that conversation towards how it, in order to get there, I still want to take a quick quiz again with the audience to see how they are looking at these different HAL mechanisms of zero trust. Can we have the second question for the quiz? Yes. So as Mazen, you yourself has been talking a lot about identity, and people think zero trust talks about identity, so zero trust is identity. So let's figure out what's the right answer.
I think we might have spoiled some of it in our conversation.
Yeah,
I think so.
If people were paying
select it.
attention.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to give them a few more seconds so that people could just recall what they have heard, and this time they can pick up a right choice. So let's see what zero trust is all about. Is it identity? Is that a myth? Oh yes, it is a myth. So again, coming back to when you say how, and I see there is a lot around, and I do understand, like as you say, Rick, you were mentioning 3 years back, if you go and you talk about zero trust, and now when you talk about zero trust, you see a kind of differentiation in this conversation. So how mature do you think people have come, or at least they are on the journey understanding zero trust?
So the identity piece especially actually helps us understand how to get rid of implicit trust. Now, one interesting thing, identity is very important, and it's probably one of the core critical elements of zero trust. But it's not the only one. That's where the mistake goes. And one tagline that I've seen and even used, I've seen used by practitioners and other vendors as well, is sometimes identity is the new perimeter. You heard of that one?
Definitely.
So if we go back and think, didn't zero trust come from the removal of perimeters and the idea that perimeters were actually the wrong way of doing security? And now we're saying, well, let's find another element that we can declare a perimeter, and that is identity. So that doesn't work. It shouldn't work that way. But some people have literally said zero trust is all about identity because identity is the new perimeter. Quite a contradicting statement. Now, what I was saying is identity helps us answer the question about how to remove implicit trust, because it answers an important question. That is, who is doing something, right? Who is on my network? Who is accessing an application? Who is developing my application? And so on. Or who is executing commands on my machine? So the identity piece answers one contextual element that we need to answer in order to remove implicit trust. So removal of implicit trust, I'm getting you a hint there, is all about getting context. If we know who is doing what, when, why, where, how, and why at the same time, so we have answered all these contextual questions, and there's no more a matter of trusting. We are validating the execution of a certain transaction or of an application and so on. That's how we get to remove implicit trust. So yes, identity, but not just identity.
And on top of that, speaking of eliminating implicit trust, it's all about the posture of the devices. Does it have enough security protection in there? Whether the device is malware infected, things like that. You need to have a look at the full context. So again, I agree with you, Ricardo, in terms of identity is a very important piece, but it's not everything. And going back to the topic of the zero trust 3 years ago and zero trust now, I think a lot of organizations are now realizing that it's not just about obviously securing remote users connected to the internet or SaaS applications, for example. It's also about securing on-premise applications, OT environments, IoT connections, and so now I'm seeing a lot of organizations who may have implemented, cloud proxy, for example, just for the remote workforce. They're now really thinking about, not just the remote workforce, but a full-fledged SASE architecture, for example, because, what they implemented is not enough in terms of protecting the entire organization. And, adding more and more products based upon different business needs and things like that, it adds more complexity and, more importantly, inconsistency, because zero trust is all about consistency, regardless of who the user is, what the devices are, where they're located, things like that. So I would say that inconsistency is definitely the key word here. Consistency is definitely the key word in terms of applying zero trust.
So what I'm getting a feeling here, and looking at what Rick has mentioned and what you have added on to the mass, is that there is a certain set of maturity that we are seeing among the customers. What they were doing 3 years back, they might only be talking identity, but as he said, identity is only one dimension to the whole zero trust. There is context, there are policies, there are other factors to it. Now, at the same time, as you said, the customer is also shifting this dimension into a different universe. Like now, they're not just talking okay, I have users, remote access only, that's all. No, they are talking about IoT, OT, other parts of it where zero trust is relevant and they want to have a conversation. So we do believe that customers are moving into that direction. They are in a maturity curve. If I say they are going a little higher, I'm not talking about the speed, how fast or slow they are, but we do, as unanimously, we do feel they are moving in different directions, but this direction is basically taking them forward into their zero trust. And that brings me back, Mas, this is specifically for you, because I know you did a research locally for Japan with the customers, and you call them a road to zero trust, to see not just to see how, but where the customers are really in their zero trust. So can you just share some key takeaways of this research that you have done?
Okay, thank you. So what we did here in Japan is, so we surveyed a lot of cybersecurity decision makers and practitioners working for businesses here in Japan, with more than 500 employees, with the revenue size of more than $300 million, about their understanding of zero trust, as well as their approach to zero trust, how they're implementing it. And in terms of the key takeaways or the findings, I think 3 things. First is about the market adoption and interest. 16% of organizations here claim they adopted zero trust as their cybersecurity strategy. And on top of that, about 70% of the respondents claimed they were evaluating or they've evaluated whether to adopt. So certainly there was a lot of interest in zero trust, which is actually a good thing. And then the second thing is about the implementation. So in order to assess, what we did was we took a bit of a holistic approach. So things like, whether they're applying least privilege access, regardless of the locations, applications, things like that, verifying all users, all devices, all apps in all locations, not just, the headquarters, but the branch offices, remote workforce, things like that. And as a result, I think the number is high or low is debatable, but 8% I find is deemed mature in terms of their approach to zero trust. So I'd say a lot of organizations are still in the early phase of their zero trust journey. And then the third thing is security operations. So adoption rate of technologies like analytics, automation, attack surface management, for example, they're all still relatively low. I guess that's probably because there's been lots of focus around access control when it comes to zero trust. So it's fairly understandable. And also here in Japan, a lot of organizations rely on third parties or the managed service providers to manage their security infrastructure. So, either way, security operations is definitely one of the key areas that needs, kind of improvement. So these are the key findings when it comes to, the Road to Zero Trust survey. But I think we gained a really good understanding of where they are, what they're trying to do, where the gaps are. So, it was a quite interesting research.
It's quite interesting that you mentioned the Security Operations Center as well. And it's probably underrated in the context of zero trust. And I've recently done an interview as well about that. I believe that the SOC is actually the best place where to gather context. And if we're talking about zero trust, we know how important context is. And the SOC is basically the location where all the alerts, all the telemetry, all the data from all the tools you have around the organization eventually ends up being. So that is a good place where to gather context. That's the place where to effectively reevaluate your policies and compare them against your zero trust outcomes. So I think there's quite a journey to get this message across to organizations and practitioners that the SOC is probably at the very core of the zero trust program.
Absolutely. I think the key word here is visibility, because if you cannot see you cannot control it, you cannot defend it, you cannot act on it. So, I would like, the audience here to remember that, the security operations is definitely a key element when it comes to, making their zero trust initiatives really, really effective.
And I reckon this thought with you guys, like, and especially the numbers, Buzz, I would say what you have done for Japan, if I would have done it here for this region, the numbers would have been almost aligned, not too far-fetched higher side, but it would be. And again, there might be some categories up and down here and there, but again, coming back to what Rick has highlighted, SOC is one element which has been underrated. Most of the people have not. Now, there are some customers also where we had a conversation and their view on SOC is pretty much very different. Like, so, well, I just love this comment of a customer. He says, for me, the SOC has been a very reactive, like it always have been the defender. I want to take, SOC as an offender. Now I have elements, I have everything, and I want to take it higher. Now, being more reactive, I want to be more proactive SOC. So now my SOC should not be just receiving, but it should be contributing back onto the security. How do I make it faster? How do I detect early? I don't have to have an incident coming back. I have everything. So I think, again, I want to emphasize this thing again in the SOC show is we have been looking at SOC as a very underrated element, but this is one of the very crucial elements when it comes to going forward in the journey of zero trust. So people should leverage it, people should put attention towards it, make an effort, and this will be long-term paying dividends in the whole zero trust journey. And with this, again, I do see there's a lot of thoughts around it, but I still believe customers are not there where we would have loved them to be in this zero trust. Definitely there are some challenges, and you guys are the best to define those challenges and share if these challenges have been identified, how we are helping customers to overcome those challenges. Maybe I'll start with Rick.
So what challenges, can you repeat the question, please, Gopesh?
So, because we do see customers have matured in the conversation. They are looking at zero trust. There are different aspects, elements they have started. People have started onto it, but still they are not adopting zero trust the way that we expect them to be. Right? They should have been on the maturity curve pretty higher. Definitely there are challenges, technology-wise, business alignment, resources, people, there could be any. But in your view, which are those bigger challenges which most of the organizations are facing, and how can they address those challenges?
Yeah, so great question, actually. So the biggest challenge I see is people don't know really where to start with zero trust. As we said at the beginning, there's the myth of complexity. So it's too big to tackle. There's too much to do. There's too much to change as well from what we were used to do. Where do we start? And one way to approach that type of conversation, we can approach it actually in two different ways. One is prioritization. If we go back to the idea that zero trust is primarily a strategy, it's almost a philosophy, and it focuses on protecting and aligning to the core business of an organization. That means that what you care to protect the most are normally the critical assets, the crown jewels, those elements that your organization needs to keep running at all times, in spite of cyber attacks. That's the real mission of a cybersecurity program. Keep in business while you are under cyber attacks. So zero trust aligns to those critical assets. So if you were looking for a place where to start applying principles of zero trust, it's where those crown jewels are. Identify them, locate them, make sure the access and interaction towards these crown jewels follows the principles of zero trust. And that's a good first step. It's a good first few steps in the right directions. So that's a great way to do it. The other one is also, instead of boiling the ocean once more, instead of trying to apply zero trust everywhere simultaneously, to identify use cases where zero trust is easily adoptable compared to the rest. One of them is the famous hybrid or remote workforce. How are my users, now that are connecting, sometimes from the office, sometimes from home, sometimes in mobility, accessing my application, especially the critical applications, as we said, prioritizing them. So that element is a clear use case where we can act on implementing principles of zero trust. Another area is, how are we currently dealing with applications that are moved to the cloud? How are we developing them today? How do we make sure that there is no implicit trust in that development lifecycle? How do we verify the identity of our developers? How do we verify the code they're using? How do we make sure the infrastructure they build with that code is secure before it gets implemented? And all that is part of zero trust. We can call that zero trust for applications, so building applications for the cloud. And then there's zero trust for infrastructure, which is the third major use case, where we have infrastructures constantly expanding, maybe still forcefully on-premise because of regulatory compliance, or because of critical infrastructure, or because of OT elements that are embedded into physical assets. So how do you make sure that no one can abuse and compromise that? And that has a lot to do with visibility and identification of all these assets that are lingering and living within our infrastructure. It has elements of segmentation, of course, but again, visibility and context is where we want to focus that approach. So two main ways, really: prioritization and identification of use cases where to start with zero trust.
Well, I think Ricardo summed it up quite nicely. And yeah, I'd like to add a little bit of a, kind of a different angle here. One of the key challenges I've seen, when I spoke to a lot of Japanese organizations here is, although, they want to have a conversation about zero trust, and they say, they want to, evaluate whether zero trust is the right approach or not. But then one of the things I found was a lack of objectives, or the lack of outcomes. So why they're doing zero trust, why is it important to them? What kind of security architecture they would like to have, in the long term. These are the things that were clearly lacking, but then still talking about zero trust. So, not necessarily goal-oriented has been a bit of a challenge here. And I've seen some organizations where, cybersecurity teams were told by their executives to work on a zero trust, but they don't really understand why they have to work on zero trust. And then I've seen a different case where, security teams are clearly thinking, we really need to work on zero trust, but then they're not getting a buy-in from their executives. So I think it boils down to, kind of a lack of relationship between IT and security teams, and also the executives and the business divisions. So I think that in order to have a, zero trust architecture within the organization, which doesn't interfere with the, the ongoing business activities, because at the end of the day, the cybersecurity strategy is there to help business continuity. So it's really important for organizations to have a common understanding of why you need zero trust for your business. And in order to have a common understanding, you need to have a working relationship with your executives, business divisions. If you don't talk to them, have a one-on-one, and ideally make it a regular conversation so that they really understand. You really understand, what the business priorities are, what kind of tools they would like to use, where they're heading, and then you could share the risks and the benefits of all these technologies, and then come to a common ground and make a resolution here.
You say something actually really important that I forgot completely to mention, but it's absolutely valid. If you don't have a team, or let's say a structured program around zero trust that involves, as you said, the technologists, but also the strategists at the top, and they basically blend with the same message across what they're trying to achieve, so setting that goal, it's very hard to progress with zero trust, because as we said, there is lack of understanding. There are too many silos, which again, zero trust helps bringing down silos. I've seen it in person in organizations, actually organizations approaching zero trust programs by blending in multiple teams that were normally separated because they were operating different tools into a common program, achieving the same goal. So that is a very powerful way to overcome some of the challenges with starting with zero trust.
Yeah, so I reckon to this, and I feel Master, you brought it very. So at times executives want it, and people just underline, they just don't understand why it's happening. And at times the people, the technical guy says, "Oh, I want to do this," but the execs don't see a value. So I think there is a layer which is missing. I don't want to call this layer another headcount, but they need a kind of zero trust architect within a company. Like maybe it's within an organization organically, or maybe somebody, but who can bridge this gap, who doesn't look like, as Ricardo says, there are small little projects that you can start, but then those projects end up being a silo called ZTN, and they fizzle out, and somebody would claim, oh, that's zero trust. So maybe an overarching kind of oversight who can map the business to the technicalities and just look through those different projects and try to bring them under the whole umbrella of zero trust framework, right? So that the organization can go in the complete zero trust rather than having per silo, per small win. So I believe that's one of the challenges, but personally, I've also seen missing at customers' end. So I think we're bang on to it. Maybe that's something which all customers should have to reckon in order to go forward with this journey of zero trust. And with that,
to add to that, like you say, one person, I think it's more one team, and in some cases it might be even a new team.
Maybe
I've seen it called in some cases zero trust steering committee or zero trust task force, and in some cases, people don't like to use even the word zero trust. One that I've seen a lot is transformation officers or transformation team. So those clearly, because they're trying to go from A to B and transform something, they are transversal. So they're not necessarily, you can't silo them into any one given team, so they can actually glue or be the gluing element among all the teams. And if they're promoting zero trust across the silos, then it works, then it progresses.
Yes. So I think, absolutely. So maybe they can name anything, but we all agree that that layer does exist. It should exist in order to have a zero trust being across the whole organization. I have some questions for you, and I will specifically start with the last one coming in, and that's for you, Maz. So for the question to you, Maz, is zero trust versus security by design. If we have to say one key difference and similarity to explain to a customer on a very high level, what would that be?
That is a very good question. Well, it's I think zero trust is all about making sure that you eliminate trust from everything, and security by design is, I'd say, probably the same thing. Because when you are developing something, there is an assumption that your software code can be breached. Your open source code may have vulnerability, for example. So, let's have security in mind from the very beginning. So I'd probably say that, it's zero trust and the security by design is, more or less the same thing, but the way you implement it is a little bit different, because security by design is about, making sure that your code is secure from design to, build, deploy, run the whole process. Whereas, zero trust is all about, verifying everything by eliminating implicit trust from the entire organization. So that's a bit of a difference here. I don't know if I answered it in a nice way.
I think you did. It's a tricky question, and I say you answered it excellently. I might add, I think they do mean the same thing. Maybe zero trust incorporates security by design. I would say security by design is probably specific to, as you mentioned, the application development lifecycle or building things that are secure even before they execute. Zero trust does that, but also tries to tackle when you're trying to retrofit it, right? In some cases, you have legacy infrastructure, you have things that are already running, and you need to go back and look at how much context am I gathering, how much visibility do I have of what is already executing. So if everything was done since the beginning of cybersecurity with security by design in mind, we wouldn't need zero trust because it would already be there.
Yeah, I think it's now the zero trust will be an overarching, and it will be a subset security by design, which it should be. Like everything should be built, embedded with security elements into it. So I think that would eventually contribute to the framework of the whole zero trust, because the element of security again is going to contribute towards the design principles of zero trust. Now, specifically, I have another question, and this I will direct to my dear friend Rick. So, Rick, I have a question. It says they would like to know which existing strategies are currently in use, and does zero trust is going to replace it, and how do they see those existing strategies playing the role in the future?
Yeah, I think there's actually a couple of examples. One specific that comes to mind to me. And I had something about this for a few number of years. There's a strategy that has been implemented for probably the best part of 30 years that I am not sure it's that strategic, but it's being called a strategy. I'm talking about defense in depth. Defense in depth is that idea of putting multiple layers at different points of control in between your assets and the outside of the organization. And it's supposed to, by layering multiple controls and sometimes redundant controls. In fact, the majority of cases of defense in depth at a network level were regarding deploying multiple layers of firewalls in different areas of the network from different vendors and so on. That type of strategy, which to me is more tactical than strategic, is clearly being replaced by zero trust. For multiple reasons. The first one of which is that defense in depth has in itself a perimeter-based approach. Let's say multiple layers. It's like developing multiple perimeters. And at the same time, as I said, it's a very tactical approach, meaning that you're not really trying to protect. You're trying more to slow down the attacker. If you think about it, with defense in depth, you're trying to put obstacles in the way of an attacker, but you're not really focusing on, hey, I know what my crown jewels are. I know the access I'm supposed to grant to them, and I can only limit access to who should access, not to trusted or implicitly trusted elements. So zero trust is clearly becoming the killer for defense in depth.
Okay, good, thanks. I think that's a very good, fair comments, because I have heard this word defense in depth for a very, very long time, and I'm sure all of us has. And as you said, largely the defense in depth was always as not to eliminate the threat altogether, but to slow it down. Like, okay, I have another fall, one fails, another one will come up, one fails, another one. So that's again is like, instead of eliminating the threat altogether, it's like we'll slow it down, and over the time we hope that we'll be able to capture it and have a response coming in through a different mechanism. So yeah. So with this, I have another question, and this is coming from our dear friend Yasir Siddiqui, but I will mix it with another question that I have with you guys. But before that, I want to flash another question, which is part of a quiz. And I would again request all our viewers to put their answers in the chat. We have an amazing prize, so the winner takes the prize home. So can we have the quiz question now? Okay. So there's a lot of, again, I remember Ricardo saying layered approach. So there is another layer called layer 3 to layer 7, and always been there. Most of the people have been trying to define zero trust across these layers. So can we do a zero trust at layer 3? That's a question. And most of the people have different various answers around it. So I will give it a few seconds to our audience to think through and come up.
Maybe we can explain for maybe we have some non-fully technical audience what layer 3 is, which is the idea of verifying a network connection with IP and ports, really, or allowing and denying traffic based on IP and ports. So only the first 3 layers of the network security stack, which is quite a technical question, I'd say. Do you have a better way of explaining, Gopesh?
No, I think you did a great job, because I did miss being a tech guys. I just skip all of these things. But thanks, Rick, for coming back in and helping customers to understand. Maybe you're right. Maybe some customers didn't get what this really layer 3. But I without further ado, let's see what the answer is, so that we can. Okay, this again is a myth around layer 3. So I will come back with this question to you, Rick, especially. Now, in this whole framework where people are claiming zero trust access and zero trust network access and all of these mechanisms, this is a discussion area going from layer 3 to layer 7. Now, can you help us elaborate this war of different layers of access mechanism, and which is the right approach? And even before you answer, this is exactly the same question which one of our audience has been asked, Yasir Siddiqui. How can we set up that granular access control for each of the users? So I think you can take it off.
It all comes together. So first of all, starting with zero trust at layer 3, we need to put ourselves in the mindset of applying zero trust at the network levels. This is obviously a use case of zero trust, which is implementing zero trust in the network. That's where the layer 3 network visibility comes from. And the reason why you can't do zero trust at layer 3 is going back to the discussion we had at the beginning, which is it's all about context. If you don't have enough context, you can't really claim that you have removed implicit trust. Now, layer 3 only answers a very minimal context regarding the connection on the network. It might tell you the IP I'm coming from, the address I'm coming from, the address I'm going to, and maybe the port and the protocol. And that's about it. That's all the level of context we have. And we've been doing that on our networks since stateful firewalls were invented. So we have been granting access based on those numbers effectively for ever so long. But back 20, 25 years ago, it wasn't such a terrible idea because a port normally was the equivalent of an application. You could identify an application by determining what port is this application running on. So if you had primarily static IP addresses and you had a few ports and protocols, then you could safely say, yeah, I kind of know who this is and I kind of know what application this is. But things have changed dramatically nowadays. And since probably the past 15 years, applications have totally outnumbered the number of ports. So we can't use a port to identify an application. We need to elevate the visibility at what we call layer 7. Layer 7 is the layer at which we can identify an application by its signature. So we can see the traffic pattern within the traffic and say, hey, I know this is Office 365, or I know this is Zoom or some other application because I identified based not on the port, but on the signature that I detect inline. And so that clearly elevates the context. On top of that, we want to identify not just the IP addresses of sources or destination, but we want to identify, as we said before, the identity of the user behind that IP address. That elevates the context once more. And finally, layer 7 also means inspecting. So we need to have the ability to detect not just who is doing the connection, what application he is accessing, but also what is he doing with that conversation. So having visibility and deep packet inspection in transit is critical for zero trust, because if not, you're trusting that connection. And that is why layer 3 is insufficient to deliver zero trust on the network.
Yeah, I think it's very imperative, as you keep saying, and I love this point coming back from you. The more context we have, the least trust we're going to put into it. So the more context we get on application, signature, whatever the base is, the more informed we are, the more granular, kind of access control we'll be able to put. And I think that's one good thing happens at layer 7. So if you are building policies, look at layer 7, not only at layer 3. Now, coming back to this war where we have seen the different layers, Matt, I have a specific question for you. Now, we all understand like the crucial point that zero trust is all about, but are you still seeing companies, rather than looking a broader aspect of zero trust, are still having a very heavy product mindset approach towards zero trust? And not just what you believe the customer is having a product mindset. Do you have some real good examples that you can share with us about how customers have successfully implemented zero trust and what we have learned from the experience working with those customers?
Oh, that's a very good question, actually. I'm seeing, still a lot of organizations maybe focused more around, procuring new technologies like SASE, EDR, things like that, for example. But maybe I can give you, one example, which is a manufacturer here in Japan with branches and subsidiaries inside and outside of the country. So what happened was, when the whole pandemic kicked off, just like any other companies, they shifted everyone to work from home. But because of their traffic was backhauling to their data center, there was a complete traffic overload that was grinding business to a halt, which is exactly what happened during the early days of the pandemic. And also, they had some challenges when it comes to applying security, especially for the branch offices. Even during the pandemic, they experienced security breaches, and as they investigated what happened, they realized that the same level of policy was not enforced at all these branch offices, which was the main reason why all these breaches happened. But the good news is that because of all the experiences, their executives and the business teams came to realize how important their IT infrastructure is and the cybersecurity infrastructure is to their business. So, that was a bit of a platform for the security teams to build on. So, what they did was, instead of just focusing on remote workforce, they really shifted the mindset to think about, what kind of architecture they need for the business, including the branch offices in and out of the country. So they took a bit of a holistic approach to the whole project. So they were thinking about how to apply cybersecurity consistently, regardless of the locations. And but at the same time, the infrastructure has to be flexible with the business needs. So these are the two main priorities they were working on. So in other words, what I'm trying to get to is that they didn't start the project by saying, "Oh, let's do zero trust." You know, so what they were doing. So I'm going to use the words I got from their key, decision maker. In his own words, what we were doing turned out to be what people call zero trust. That's how he described it. So, the key takeaway here is going back to what I was saying earlier. It's all about having a business alignment with the executives and the business teams to make sure that, it's not just about enforcing, stringent cybersecurity measures. It's about understanding business, understanding their requirements, and implement the security measures that are required to keep the business going. So, I think it was a really, really interesting story.
So I realized, like, as you said, most of the customers, like, same question goes, what is the strategy? Like they have been like embedding the security, embedding some controls. So a partial of these zero trust have been done. Maybe consciously, unconsciously, customers are moving towards it, but it would be nicer if we can make a conscious effort and look at the complete framework and move the direction. Now, instead of having these, unconscious efforts, which may be a little fabricated, I think it's up to us to help customers to look them in a broader way, have a more conscious decision, looking at the framework that this is my journey and these are the milestones to go on to it. Now, I have so many other
actually,
questions.
And Gopesh, by the way, most customers, if not all organizations, really are somewhere on the map of zero trust already. They don't realize it because following some of the most, let's say, even from a compliance perspective and following some of the principles of cybersecurity in general puts them on the journey towards zero trust. It's a matter of maturity sometimes, and maturity can be measured, can be understood when compared against how far are we in implementing these principles for our critical assets, for example. Or maybe we have the ability to identify users, so that's a good start, but we are not able to identify what applications they're accessing. So they've done that almost, as you say, subconsciously or without knowing that they were working towards a zero trust program, but they've moved in the right direction. They've moved the needle in the right direction. Now, the important thing is normally rationalization, so rationalizing and reducing the number of fragmented products in your organization tends to streamline the progress towards zero trust maturity. So that's another big consideration that I believe Mas has mentioned. How do businesses rethink their approach to investing in technology and simplifying it?
Exactly. I think it's all about rethinking, reconsidering the alignment. Once the alignment happens, all the efforts go into the right direction around it. And that helps me put some context to my next question, Rick. But even before I go to the next question, I would like to pull up the fourth question of our quiz for today. Adopting effective zero trust strategy will reduce the impact of zero trust attack and block many attacks outright. Now, people are questioning, does zero trust strategy, if they implement, would it have an impact in helping them protect from known, unknown attacks? Would it do it right away? Or is it a myth? Is it a truth? How should they look at it? Like, what's the benefit coming out of the whole implementation of zero trust strategy? Any comments from you guys? Till the time we get some time
I'd be
to
interested.
audience.
I'm interested to see the audience choice on this because I have a feeling that a good cybersecurity strategy should aim at reducing that risk, but is zero trust the right one for it? I'd say.
So I would request all the audiences to put their answers in the chat. As I said, the winner takes an amazing, surprising gift home. So please participate into our little quiz. And with that, I think it's time for us to reveal the truth. Yes. So zero trust will help you reduce the impact of any zero-day attacks, known, unknown, and block many other attacks outright. Now, we do understand that zero trust has this amazing outcome coming out to it. And I have spoken to customers, and Maz was saying it has to be more outcome-driven conversations in order to align those business requirements. But guys, I have a question here, and this is a real question coming from: how does the organizations or the teams will measure the effectiveness of their zero trust architecture? Are there any kind of metrics that they should be tracking in order to see the success of the zero trust implementation?
Maz, do you want to take it or do you want me to?
Okay.
No,
Yeah, I can start off first. Well, I'd say probably a good example would be like, for example, the number of incidents or cases. Ideally, no major incidents, but then incidents will happen. Alerts will be triggered. So I think things like, how quickly all these incidents can get resolved, how many cases were resolved without human intervention, things like that. These could be, some of the good metrics to, have a think about. But at the same time, again, it's not just about the metrics that are directly related to the outcomes, but it's also about the metrics that actually measure the effectiveness of your approach to zero trust or cybersecurity in general. So, for example, like, try reducing the amount of weeks and months taken to investigate a specific, case to, like, let's say days or hours, ideally, or even minutes, for example. Or try reducing the number of alerts that require human intervention, from like, thousands to like, maybe 100 or maybe a few, ideally. So, I think zero trust is about a journey. So, obviously, making the number of cases to zero is not going to happen overnight. So it's about, trying to improve step by step and, try to reduce all these numbers. That could be probably, one of the ways to, have a look at. I'm not sure if it's the right answer or not, but what do you think, Rick?
I really liked it. I think you're right on the money there with the answer. I mean, there are tangible metrics that can be, derived from, as you said, the number of incidents or the speed at which we can react and sometimes be proactive about things. Rationalizing tools, for example, in the context of zero trust, will reduce the number of data sources that you will need to cater for. They will reduce the number of efforts in stitching together that information. It will make it simpler to analyze the data at the same time, and in most cases, easier to automate. There's also the aspect of the maturity, right? How do we measure how far we are on a zero trust journey? One is the outcome, and one is being able to map yourself against certain maturity models. And we and many other organizations offer as well maturity models around zero trust. And normally they come in phases. As I said, most organizations are on the spectrum, let's say, of zero trust somewhere. They might have started with segmentation, but not least privilege. They might have started with identity, but not inspection. And so if you map yourself against those maturity models, and especially, again, focusing, remembering on where does it make a difference is in relation to your critical assets, your critical applications, your data sets that you can't afford to have compromised, and you find yourself where you sit in that maturity model, then you can start moving one step further, doing incremental improvements to get to a more comprehensive zero trust. Which leads me to say, by the way, that there is no end game with zero trust. You can't really say, oh, I'm done. I've done zero trust. I got everything under zero trust. It's a journey. It's a continuous improvement, but you can be in a high, let's say, high percentile of the success rate of zero trust or in the low one. The maturity needs to be adopted over time.
Yeah, I think it's as you said, it's a journey, and there are no well-defined matrix in industry or anywhere which says, okay, the 4 tick box, you are in phase 1, 4 ticks box. So there are none. But coming back to Maz's point, how people are measuring, one is like incident response. If they have a right zero trust framework being implemented, their IR should be better. Like they should be able to detect much faster than what they do in today. I have an example here, and I love to share. I know we are top of the hours, but I'll still go ahead and share it. So I was talking to one of the customers, and they said we started the journey of zero trust. So they don't know how the benefits are coming, but over the time they shared is once they started doing this, the first thing they did a consolidation of identity, both on user and application side, and suddenly the number of access and ID based tickets dropped by 70%. Like suddenly their operations were better. They were having less number of tickets. And at the same time, now they say, now I know what I have to implement for me to buy a new technology and integrate. My definitions are there. So I don't go through the whole cycle of heavy integration. I know my requirement and I know if a technology has to come, what's the play for it in the framework. So I think as Rick said, there could be different mechanisms, different benefits coming in, but over the time, as you move into this journey, people will start realizing these benefits. So maybe they will become their matrix of success. But yes, people will start seeing these benefits as a return onto their journey for the zero trust.
Hey,
Now, I know,
Dipesh, you know which one is an interesting metric that people don't think about when implementing zero trust? In fact, they think that it goes the other way, is user experience. It has been demonstrated that doing zero trust properly and transparently, as you say, creates less tickets, but not just from a security perspective, but from a user experience as well. So if it's done properly, user will actually end up having a better experience because the security will be just implemented by default, if you want, by design, as we were saying before, instead of having to be bolted on and create obstacles for the users.
Absolutely. I think that zero trust would help ease. Again, there is no measuring of it, but it will ease the user experience friction, which typically has been there with the security teams. So I believe like we are going to enhance it. We're not going to deteriorate it with zero trust, and people will see it. Maybe over a time, we are able to come up with some kind of industry matrix to measure all of these things. But as I said, in today's time, as and when the people start realizing these benefits, they will start putting a matrix around it. But they would definitely see once they start their journey onto zero trust. Now, I know, guys, I had more question to ask, but thank you for all your insight and perspective to help people to navigate into the zero trust journey, dissect the myths and the misconceptions surrounding a zero trust, and giving them the reality check and some examples how people are implementing and going forward. And for our audiences, if you would like to know more about zero trust or looking for help in your journey, feel free to reach out to us and we'll be more than happy to assist with you. With that, I would like to close today's sessions for the next episode. Thank you, everyone.